Carole Satyamurti is a contemporary poet. She's still working today, and she's pictured here doing a reading of 6 poems for a YouTube video that you can look up if you enjoy war photographer. She doesn't shy away from really difficult, complex, often painful subjects. You can hear her on YouTube reading poems about cancer, for example. She seems to be interested in our fragility as human beings trying to survive in a dangerous world. And she also explores the tension between people's separate lives in her poems. And you'll see both of these themes key in War Photographer. The poem was written in 1987 when there were several wars happening across the globe. There are always wars happening, aren't there? There was the Gulf War between Iran and Iraq, the Afghan-Russian War. There was also a civil war in Uganda where Carole Satyamurti actually lived for part of her life. She has lived in various places across the world. But really the precise setting for this poem is irrelevant. It's a poem about war and its impact on children, because of course modern wars aren't fought on battlefields, as in Charge of the Light Brigade. They're fought across cities, and civilians are caught up more than ever before. 500,000 estimated to have died in the Iran-Iraq conflict, for example. So that's some context, and now we'll hear the poem read before exploring its language in some detail.
War Photographer. The reassurance of the frame is flexible. You can think that just outside it people eat, sleep, love normally, while I seek out the tragic, the absurd, to make a subject. Or if the pictures such as lifts the heart, the firmness of the edges can convince you this is how things are. As when at Ascot once I took a pair of peach sun-gilded girls rolling silk crumpled on the grass in champagne giggles. As last week, when I followed a small girl staggering down some devastated street, hip thrust out under a baby's weight. She saw me seeing her, my finger pressed. At the corner, the first bomb of the morning shattered the stones. Instinct prevailing, she dropped her burden and, mouth too small for her dark scream, began to run. The picture showed the little mother, the almost smile. Their caption read, "Even in hell the human spirit triumphs over all." But hell, like heaven, is untidy. Its boundaries arbitrary as a blood stain on a wall.
This poem is written in 5 stanzas of free verse. So there's no regular rhythm, no rhyme scheme, and it does sound quite like natural speech. It's written in the first person, and we do get a sense of the war photographer almost talking to us with no artifice, just very honestly about his art. We can infer from the war photographer's words, from the speaker's words, that his work troubles him. He has a troubled conscience, perhaps, and that's evident from the reflections in the first stanza, reflections that are in the present tense. The next few stanzas then move into the past tense as he remembers particular photographs that he's taken. The first photograph he remembers is of 2 girls at Ascot drinking champagne. This image, of course, connotes wealth, luxury, freedom to have fun. In very sharp contrast, the third stanza describes a picture he took only a week ago, and this was of a girl staggering down the street in some war-torn zone with a baby on her hip. He remembers that the girl caught his eye and he took a picture. The next stanza describes what happened immediately after the picture was taken. A bomb went off down the street and the girl dropped the baby and ran screaming. Then the final stanza of the poem tells us about the picture caption which went with the photograph when it appeared in the newspaper. Even in hell, the human spirit triumphs over all. Reflecting in the present tense again, just as in the opening of the poem, The speaker reflects on this, on its simplistic dishonesty. So we've established already that in this poem Satyamurti is talking from the point of view of a war photographer, somebody who obviously doesn't just take photographs of war, but who nonetheless is involved in that work and is troubled by it. It's a troubled voice that we're hearing in the poem. The task of the war photographer is perhaps to shine a light into some of the darkest, most brutal corners of the world. But in this poem, the speaker seems to be questioning whether that is in fact what happens with his pictures. The picture described in this poem told a lie in the end. There was no triumph for that girl. The photograph didn't tell the whole story. So looking more closely at use of language, this is the opening stanza in the present tense, with the photographer reflecting on his art and really its limitations. He's aware that the images that he creates can be interpreted a range of ways, and he feels in this stanza that people interpret things the way they want to. The alliterative phrase, "the frame is flexible," really captures that idea. So the frame is the border around a photograph. You can think that just outside it, i.e. the frame, people eat, sleep, love normally, while I seek out the tragic, the absurd to make a subject. So he's saying there that we can convince ourselves that the image within this frame doesn't reflect normal life. This is freakish. This is unusual. This is not something that should trouble us really, because it isn't what life is really like. In normal life, we eat, we sleep, we love, all is good. Yes, tragic things happen, absurd things happen, but we needn't worry about those too much because that's not normal life. However, if the picture is positive, if, to quote from the poem, it lifts the heart, then that firm edge around the frame suddenly disappears, and we as consumers of these photographs, these images, we convince ourselves that this is how life really is. This picture represents something bigger than itself. It's symbolic of a good life. It's how things are, and we all feel great. So this is the war photographer's moral dilemma, really. He's, we assume, trying to shine a light into the dark corners of the world, as I said earlier, but he feels that he can't do that because he can't control the way his photographs are interpreted. And troubling ones are compartmentalised by readers of newspapers. They are dismissed as being freakish aberrations, whereas feel-good pictures represent life. And that word reassurance in the opening line is key here. Whatever he photographs, people are reassured by it. And reassured people are complacent people. They're not people who are going to change anything, who are going to say, look, stop, this is wrong. And that is a frustration to a war photographer who is possibly trying to make a difference, who wants people at least to care about what's happening in the world. In the second stanza of the poem, the speaker illustrates his theme. So here we have one of those pictures that represents the way things are, a feel-good picture that exists beyond its frame, which somehow represents life. It's a picture of two girls at Ascot. So these are girls enjoying a day at the races, not any old races either. Ascot is associated very much with affluence. It's the place where the royals watch horse racing events. When you look at the imagery in this stanza, it's all about luxury, privilege, affluence. The girls are described as sun-gilded. Now, something that's gilded is coated in gold. So, on the one level, this is a description of their sun-tanned colour, but also it connotes wealth. They're wearing silk which is crumpled because they're rolling in the grass. which evokes feelings of freedom and lightness, and they're giggling because they're drinking champagne. Again, ideas of lightness, bubbles, and also champagne is obviously a very expensive drink, but we get the impression these are two girls that don't have to worry about the cost of anything really. They're living the good life. The speaker begins the next stanza with the same word, as. So we had as when, and now we have as last week. And this invites us to make a comparison. It's a comparison that couldn't be more stark, and which introduces a strong theme of inequality, unfairness, the haves and the have-nots. The setting has changed now from Ascot to some devastated street. That use of the word some is almost dismissive, isn't it? It's not important enough to be given a name. It's not in this country, after all. The subject of the photographer's picture is not the gilded, giggling girls of Ascot anymore, but a small girl who is staggering. Contrast that verb with the previous one, rolling in the grass. This girl is staggering. She's carrying a baby, and it's the weight of the baby which is presumably impeding her progress. The idea of weight, contrasting with the girl's heady lightness in the previous stanza, is carried through into the next stanza. This small girl carries not just a physical weight, but also the heavy weight of responsibility. The photographer who followed her down the street presses his finger to take a photograph just after she met his eye for a second. Important to notice the hissing sibilance in this stanza, which actually is a feature of the next as well. Last small, staggering, devastated street saw me seeing her pressed. Obviously, the subject matter has darkened at this point in the poem. We're dealing with the evil of war, and the sound of the poem reinforces that evil. Then there's an explosion. The first bomb of the morning shattered the stones. That idea of this being the first bomb of the morning introduces the idea that bombing is routine in this area. This is the first, but there will surely be more, because bombing is part of everyday life. In order to save herself, instinct prevailing, the girl dropped her burden. Again, that notion of heaviness, responsibility, weight, connoted by the word burden. But then we get the most devastating image of the poem, mouth too small for her dark scream. The poet's suggesting here perhaps that such a small child should never make a sound so full of anguish and despair as this child makes as she runs to save herself. The ellipsis at the end of the stanza there makes us wonder what happened to her next. We don't know. In this final stanza, the girl is referred to as a little mother, emphasising this idea of her responsibility, the burden that she should never have had to carry as a child so young. The caption that went with the picture read, "Even in hell, the human spirit triumphs over all." We know as readers, of course, that that is a simplistic lie. There was no triumph of the human spirit. The girl, to save herself, had to drop the baby. That was no triumph. Clearly it was a disaster, a catastrophic event. So that saying, "a picture never lies," is challenged in this poem, isn't it? It's revealed to be complete nonsense, that idea. The word arbitrary is important in the final line of the poem. Something that's arbitrary is subject to individual will or judgment without restriction. So an arbitrary decision is one that you couldn't call, you couldn't predict. Equally, this kind of warfare is arbitrary. Presumably the baby that was abandoned died. We don't know for sure, but that's likely to be the case. No reason why that baby should have died. That baby wasn't a soldier. The death was completely arbitrary, random and senseless. In that sense, hell, which we could interpret as representing suffering, horror, hell is also arbitrary because it can appear anywhere. It can't be contained within boundaries. And that word boundaries, of course, links with the opening of the poem and the idea of the reassurance of the frame. The speaker is stripping away that reassurance, is telling us that things aren't either good or bad, heaven or hell, as much as we'd like to perhaps. We can't honestly compartmentalise experience in that way. During war, hell has no boundaries. It's as arbitrary as a blood stain on a wall. That final, very visual image reminding us of the victims of conflict of this type. Among these, children and babies. A complex poem then, one that makes us think really hard and which introduces a range of themes. Clearly, one key one is inequality. We've got the contrast between the girls at Ascot and this little mother. The poem also focuses on the innocent victims of war, connecting with those other poems in the anthology that explore the pity of war, its senselessness. There's an implicit criticism of the modern media that it should package up images of war in order to sanitise it, even to make readers feel good about it. That's essentially very dishonest, because nobody triumphs if they're living in a war-torn zone. And finally, we're criticised as consumers of these images because the speaker is suggesting that we delude ourselves by interpreting them in a way that makes us feel reassured and comfortable. In that opening stanza, the speaker suggested that good stories we tend to read as representing something larger than themselves, whereas painful images we dismiss as being irrelevant, or at least unusual, freakish, and nothing that we need to particularly be concerned about. In this way, nothing changes.